But I think the issue of regional economic integration is being driven by, well, let me say South Africa is championing it largely because South Africa is one of the leading economies on the continent, accounting for about 25% of the total GDP of the continent. But also, South Africa, remember, is one of the biggest investors in the continent. And thirdly, we play a key role in terms of conflict resolution, post-conflict reconstruction in many countries on the continent. And so our role in the continent is very pervasive, but it's also born of a recognition that you cannot have a prosperous South Africa in the absence of a prosperous SADC region, for example, or Sub-Saharan African region. And so it is imperative that we all prosper. So regional economic integration is at the center of, amongst others, our strategy as the Sub-Saharan African region. But we talked about the issue of infrastructure. The whole new economic partnership for Africa's development program of infrastructure, South Africa champions that as well. And the intent behind that is to actually reverse the contours of some of the infrastructure, let's talk about rail infrastructure on the continent, which all kind of leads towards, the seas, because that was the intent, to focus on extracting industries, extract the raw materials out through the harbors, ship them out. And part of the strategy in terms of developing infrastructure such as rail on the continent actually seeks to reverse that, because we would like to take advantage of the principal concept contained in the Sinai Declaration that China, for example, needs to focus on increased beneficiation within the continent. It is not just in South Africa, it's within the continent, because the NEPA declaration is contained in the Sanya statement of intent. And that's why I was saying that it really requires the political will and cooperation of African leaders to ensure that that win-win situation that you're talking about emerges. Thanks.
Two questions came up from the other panelists that I'd like to invite them to pursue, and then I think I'll open up things to the audience. There was the question of localized, meaning regional or sub-regional integration, and then there's the question of negotiating international integration into the global economy. And I wonder what my fellow panelists' thoughts are on how this can best be achieved, given the current state of play, which is the spaghetti bowl that Harry Broadman described for us. How do we proceed from this balkanized state of many countries, including many small countries, toward really much more effective, not just legalistic but not applied regional or sub-regional integration? And then how do these small countries negotiate their global integration into the international economy without simply becoming passengers on somebody else's train with little say about where they're going or when they're going to get there?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. African governments recognize their limited capacity to negotiate. That's why they have given an explicit mandate to the African Union Commission to present a common platform in negotiating with both traditional donors as well as the new emerging partners. And the African Union has developed what is called the African Union Common Position. That common position defines key priorities for Africa's development, including infrastructure development, industrial development, technology transfer, agriculture development, and human capital development. This common position is supposed to form to serve as a basis for Africa's negotiating with the new emerging partners. Now, to what an extent do individual African countries use this common position in negotiating with the new emerging partners? That's a different issue. So clearly there is a need for mobilizing political will at the highest level in African governments to ensure that commitments and their own directives are implemented. Now, and in terms of how we could use regional groups to strengthen African countries' negotiation, I would just want to refer to the case of the World Trade Organization. In the context of the Doha Development Round, African countries have sought to leverage the power of regional organization to develop common position on some of the key issues that are being negotiated at the World Trade Organization. And they've also sought to form what we call strategic alliances with group-minded countries, for example, the African, Caribbean, and Pacific nations, when it came to negotiating with the European Union on the Economic Partnership Agreement. And I think, given the limited capacity, both in terms of resources and human capital, this is the best way, really, for African governments to leverage, the power to leverage their bargaining power and to make sure that at least they are able to get a better deal when they negotiate with emerging partners.
I'm a firm believer in multilateralism, really. So, in a way, especially for the smaller countries, in the ultimate, it really is an issue of getting your own house in order. The world market is very large, and if your house is in order, I think there is plenty of opportunities to penetrate the markets. Look at the successful countries. China, it didn't have any regional arrangement with the European Union, it didn't have any arrangement with the United States, NAFTA, whatever, in the end, the house was, its own house was in order and trade could expand. Largely because I really think that the world markets are substantially open today. I mean, if you're talking about the 1945, it's a different story because the world markets were themselves not so open. India for a long time, you look at what 1970s, trade, like imports 4% of the GDP, exports 5% of the GDP. That's where it was. But the problem was not, India complained forever actually about the world economic order being against and stacked against the developing countries and so forth. And many of you might know that India was really the leader of the G77 in those days, carrying that kind of flag. But ultimately, once it got its house in order, trade expanded dramatically and rapidly. You look at 1991, exports plus imports are about total of 16-17% of the GDP. Today, about over 50%, 3 times what they are, and that is during a period when the GDP, which is in the denominator of that trade to GDP ratio, is itself rising at 6 to 7% per year over a period of 25 years. So I really think that this whole movement towards regionalism, I think led by the United States, really brought conversion of the United States ultimately when it negotiated NAFTA, changing the entire dynamics of the trading system has been an unfortunate one. But from the country's point of view, really, in the end, the first thing is really to get their own houses in order. Mr. Chairman, just since you mentioned one thing, I will take issue with you about just as all Africa is not the same, all BRICS are not the same. So certainly, India has been known to Africa very, very well actually for easily over 100 years. Mahatma Gandhi really started off his Satyagraha and Ahimsa in South Africa. As many as 21 years he has spent there experimenting and really learning and perfecting the movement. And, but for what he learned in South Africa, India would not probably have been freed in 1947. Also, I think eventually many of the African leaders, at least from what I have read, drew inspiration from Mahatma Gandhi, leaders like Kenyatta and Nyerere, and many others actually. And third, of course, the Indian community, Indians have been very much present in Africa, a large number of the African countries, culturally also. So, at least from what I have read in the last, once the relationship between Africa and India began to warm up, because largely driven by the expansion of the trade that has happened in just 7 or 8 years' time, I think they understand each other quite well actually, and the relations in general are very, very cordial. So that relationship, even on the political kind of level, again, it has to be ultimately at the country level, on both sides. I mean, but certainly there, India is probably a little different than other BRIC countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I also wanted to comment on one of the points that you made, that Africa has limited knowledge of China. I should indicate that Africa has always had a bilateral relationship with China and India. If I remember correctly, I think this relationship dates back to 1956 during the Bandung Conference in Indonesia. And of course, that was driven pretty much by political consideration. And China and India supported a number of African countries in their liberation struggle. The ANC, the SWAPO in Namibia, they were supported by India, China, materially and also financially, militarily and otherwise. And that was very important in terms of hastening the process of decolonization. What is different today between the relationship, in the relationship between Africa and China is that the emphasis today is more on economic issues because, of course, China now and India, they become significant global actors. They have been recording the fastest growing rates in the world. But even if it's true that Africa understanding of India, or of China in particular, is limited, that should not necessarily place Africa at a competitive disadvantage. I think what Africa really needs is to develop a better understanding of the emerging partners' interest. What is it that they want in Africa? Because India is different from China, China is different from Brazil. Each has its own set of core strategic interests. So we need to understand those interests so that we could fashion an appropriate strategic response. Thank you.
I just very quickly, I happen to be writing a book about China and Africa, and have spent much of the last year traveling in Africa researching the book. And there's an interesting test that you can engage in, which gets at a couple of the last couple of comments, and that is, you ask, I'm not talking about the man in the street who you stop at random. You can talk to a minister in his office, or a researcher in a university, or somebody at quite a high level, and you ask them, can you name 5 Chinese people for me? And it is often impossible. This suggests a somewhat superficial grasp of China as a subject. Yes, you know that formally there's been this certain history that in 1959, for example, China established diplomatic relations with Guinea, and in 1966, I think it was, 70, I'm not going to cite years. China built the Tazara Railway, and so you have these highlights, but this is a kind of a Wikipedia familiarity with history. It's not really, doesn't really suggest an intimate connection with the country. I'm not saying this unsympathetically. I'm saying I'm all for Africans really getting to know China, and really getting to know India, and really getting to know all of the BRICS, because I think that's the best way they can protect their interests. That's the best way they can derive the most appropriate lessons to their own development. That's the best way to plug into the rest of the world in a healthy, positive way. the comparative disadvantage that I suggested was meant only to say that if you don't know who you're dealing with really well, you're not likely to be able to extract maximum value from the way you're dealing with it. That's all. I'd like to take that. I don't want to turn this into too much of a back and forth. Can we? I'll come to microphone. Look at you. I promise. They were ready. You're on the list. Could you? Yeah. Please. Yes.
Thank you, Ken Johnson, Konya, International Development, Sub-Saharan Africa. A couple of quick points. I recognize, I think the gentleman from the UN pointed out that Africa is a de-industrialization. I believe there's an UNCTAD study that did support that Africa, if you look at the manufacturing as a percentage of GDP, rather manufacturing as a percentage of GDP, over the past 20 years, it has fallen and has fallen rather precipitously. My question then becomes, Africa continues to be pretty much used as an extractive region, right? So if you were to subtract petroleum from Africa's export to the United States, it's really, really paltry. So one of the things that I've always promoted is what I call value-added processing, in-country value-added processing. Now, many U.S. and Western companies open up branches or plants in China because of cheaper labor. Do you first of all see that countries in the BRIC countries would potentially look at Africa now in the similar light to say that we could potentially open up processing, at least the first primary or secondary processing there before it gets exported back to the BRIC countries for final production? Maybe one of you can.
Could I ask if you have someone in particular in mind for your question?
Whoever feels that they can answer is fine.
Anybody?
I've actually written a book on this question. You can sit outside and argue with you at a discount if you get it. This has been happening only recently in China, in Africa, where they are climbing the value chain. And it's a result of the first point that I made, which is more and more African countries are becoming integrated into the world trading system, not just members of the WTO, but actually engaged in what economists call network trade. And ironically, which you'll know when you read my book, that it's as a result, in part, I got one more shot of that. You'll see from the data, the firm level data, that as a result of the Chinese and Indian investment, compared to African firms as a control group, you'll see that the percentage of value added in exports produced on the continent is actually higher in the Chinese and Indian firms that are operating on the continent than the African firms themselves. The point is that if you negotiate, you can in fact get higher value added and greater diversification in terms of exports on the continent. But I want to return to this other point that you mentioned about manufacturing, the whole industrialization debate. I'm old enough that I worked on Capitol Hill during the 1980s when we were very scared about our own competitiveness here in the United States and the whole question of deindustrialization.
Did that stop, by the way?
Debate?
Or we stopped being scared?
Well, no, it's not. It's certainly not. But I think part of the argument is misplaced. Manufacturing is great, but so is services trade. So is agricultural trade. In fact, one can make the argument for a place like African countries where there's a surplus of labor and a shortage of capital, that one of the ways out of the growth dilemma is to use labor-intensive technologies and enter into labor-intensive sectors. And they have not exploited that.
Yeah, but that comes from agro-based industries as well, so that falls under that same rubric.
Yeah. So, anyway.
Thank you. Please, yes, I couldn't. I'd like to ask everyone to identify themselves first, and also to be sure to formulate a question.
My name is Jacqueline Span. I'm the President of Education and Literacy Fund for Africa. My question goes to three people on the panel. It's one question. The professor from India, I'd like to know, you mentioned how much money India has made on Africa. How much money has Africa made in trade in India? And the same question goes to Mr. Brodman. In terms of the United States and Europe, how much money has Africa made in the United States and in Europe? And Mr. Matola from South Africa, how much money has Africa made from India, China, and Brazil?
Thank you.
Yeah, so well, on trade, we know actually that of the about roughly $40 billion of trade between the two countries,
Between all the $40 billion worth of trade between Africa and India, about exports from Africa are about 23-24 billion, and imports into Africa from India are about 15-16 billion. So the balance certainly is in favor of Africa. But I should say that a lot of these exports from Africa to India is in the mineral oils. So it is. On investment, I don't have the figures. The only ones I could track down were about the investments made by India in Africa. But in the reverse, what investments Africa is making into India, I don't have the numbers.
I guess it's my turn. And for the last time, if you would just buy my book, you would find out the numbers. And I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but it's certainly the case that the exports from Africa to the U.S. and the EU, as Arvind has said, in the case of India, are raw materials and resources. And so exports certainly, overwhelm imports or exports, from Africa to the United States and the European Union are not high value added products, which is what I think you're after. In terms of investment, that's the case that I'm making, which is that African countries have to become competitive first at home, because the rule in economics is very simple. If you want to be successful abroad, you have to be first successful, generally speaking, at home. So the amount of investment, the amount of trade that is valuable for Africans in the United States and the EU is relatively small. And where it's sizable, it's largely the result of the AGOA agreements, trade preferences, everything but arms agreements, and perhaps maybe in the EPAs that have recently been negotiated. I would prefer Africans to become competitive without those kinds of sweeteners. I think it's great now, it's part of the industrial policy that I'm speaking of. But ultimately, the question is how can they export more and more to our countries.
Thank you. I think I won't give you the exact figures, but if you just take India, if you look at the trade, exports versus imports, with almost a balanced leg. It's projected that this is 2011, we're about 10 billion. 10 billion. We were looking at about getting it up to 15 billion in terms of trade, two-way trade between the two countries. With China, obviously, that's why I mentioned earlier that we need to balance. There's more imports, especially of finished products out of China into South Africa, and a lot more of raw materials out of South Africa to China. So there is an imbalance there in terms of two-way trade. Other countries such as Brazil as well, again, on a much lower basis. But I would say there's a huge disparity in terms of two-way trade. It's still small compared to what the trade between India and China, for an example. In terms of investment, China was ranked about our 5th in terms of investment flows, direct investment, not counting small transactions, but direct fixed investment into South Africa. With the financial crisis, it dropped down slightly, so they're now sitting in number 12 after our top countries such as the USA, UK, Germany, and a few others. So basically, you get 12 in China. So it just gives you a sense as to the two-way trade as well as investment flows, especially for the direct investment.
Thank you. We have limited time, so I'd like to ask people to ask single questions to one person if possible, and to, well, as panelists, have to be brief also in our answers. There's a gentleman in the corner there. Yeah.
Thank you. Muhammad Adema, I'm a student at journalism school. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Forgive me if this has been discussed or if this was asked before I came in, but my question is, we're looking at a very troubling trend in Africa, especially now we're discussing agriculture as a potential area of investment. But we're looking at, on the one hand, where Africans are starving and begging for food, and on the other hand, we're looking at massive land deals, essentially at no cost given away to foreigners. And a lot of the produce is also being exported to countries like India and China and other places, the BRICS. So if you could just comment on that, what are the Africans thinking when they're just giving away this land for free for 100 years lease? Two, why are we not talking about that as a major issue? Thank you.
You didn't direct this at somebody in particular, so I'm going to take my prerogative as the moderator and try briefly to give an answer. Was it directed at someone in particular?
No. It'd be great if somebody from It'd be nice if somebody from India and then, of course, the panelists from Africa can comment on that.
I mean, I don't know the details of this, but the way I would think of the issue is that, well, first, if this figure is correct that 60% of the world's uncultivated but cultivable land is in Africa, then I don't understand why not do it? I mean, use whatever one can use to promote the use of land, but make good deals. I mean, if it is being leased, let's say, for whatever number of years, and 100 is not good, then do it 10, but extract the price. I mean, in a way, you want to make the land valuable to Africans, and one way to make it valuable is let somebody use it productively. And then if it is an issue of food security, you can certainly require whatever is produced there to be first sold in Africa, or at least Africa having the first right of refusal, the first Africans would buy. Only if they refuse, then it is exported. It seems to me that this is not something that is not a win-win. It's certainly, if you got that much of vast land which is unused, whatever different ways it can be used should be used, with the proviso that you don't want to give it for free to anybody. So extract the price, but I would say put it to good use.
You don't agree, so you can talk after.
My name is Moses, and
I wanted to respond briefly to the comment from on the agricultural lands in Africa. I do share your concerns that given the precarious state of agricultural development in Africa and the fact that Africa is one of the largest continents with a number of food insecure people, I think it's important that the African governments use the agricultural land to address issue of food security. Of course, as you know, Africa lacks financial resources, and I think this is one of the reasons for welcoming foreign investment into agriculture. But I think the mistake is that the produce is for external markets, and I think that is the problem that I have with the way African governments are dealing with the agricultural land. So I think governments should try to leverage their comparative advantage in arable agricultural land to boost agricultural productivity and to make sure that they address the problem of food insecurity. Thank you.
I would just like to add that I'm sympathetic to Professor Panagaria's viewpoint in certain ways, but The pattern that I've often seen in the research for my book, which is where I wanted to come at this answer from, is that these deals are very often done very much like other mineral and natural resource deals. And that means that they're negotiated politically by people who are in positions of power, either in the central government, very often in the presidency itself, or in localized government, and they're done in a very untransparent way and with immense amounts of corruption involved. And therefore, you're signing away, it's not the idea that you're signing away rights to land for 100 years that's the biggest offense in my mind. It's the idea that it's all the money's going into one person's pocket or a small group of people's pocket. The local people are not taken into account. There's no transparency or local opportunity for local input in terms of the structuring of the deal. And the money is very often in Switzerland. So for me, transparency comes first as an issue.
My name is Moses, and I'm originally from Senegal and Ghana. I'm currently an MBA student and interning at the UN. I just wanted to kind of make a few comments.
We need questions, please.
Well, there will be a question at the end then. But
we've got like 12 minutes left, so you should probably start with the question.
Okay, I'll start. Well, I was asked to introduce myself, but anyways,
no, I mean,
going into the question. So I think one of the comments that was made was, just from listening to the panel, it seems as though there's not a lot of inventiveness, creativeness, experimentation that's going on the continent. But I kind of disagree with that because I know that, for example, in terms of diversifying, etc., in Senegal, there's now the tech sector that's somewhat, I won't say booming or anything, but there's an increasing investment in new technologies, tech sector, information communications, etc. And so now it's not uncommon if you're in France, for example, calling a customer service center, the person picking up you may think is a French person, but they're actually not. They're sitting in a call center in Senegal. And I know this specifically because a lot of my friends who did their studies in Senegal, graduated, can't find a solution. So I'm just saying, like, is there perhaps, to phrase it into a question, is there perhaps like some sort of misunderstanding, lack of dissemination of information in terms of the positive initiatives and the creativity and inventiveness that's going on the continent that's not being spread to perhaps encourage young people like myself and others here to give us hope, incentive, etc. Just talking about negative things.
Let me answer your question because I think you want to give other people a chance, and I'm from New York, so I can speak quickly. This is the problem when we're talking about Africa as a homogeneous unit, right? So there are countries, which I mentioned, who are doing the experiments, who are competing against others. If you look in Rwanda, they've done some great things in Rwanda. You look in Uganda, you look in your home countries. So yeah, this is happening. My point about the experimentation was that there's not enough, okay? Experimentation and in competition among the countries, you know? That's not unique to Africa, right? You look at any emerging market situation and you see this.
Let me just add. Sorry if we gave that impression, but certainly from what I have observed of India's engagement with Africa, it has got to be a huge amount of activity, big changes. Is the areas in which India is engaged, certainly most of them, really involve a lot of engagement. You know, going from $3 billion worth of trade to 40 billion worth, and all the investment that Indians are making in Africa. I just don't see it because this is a country mostly coming with IT, telecommunications, those sorts of things. Unless there was some action going on the African side, I just don't see how that investment could be going on. So certainly, but also there is an issue here. You know, if you look at the New York Times and the press in the United States, certainly it does a very, very poor job of conveying what is the good action that is happening in Africa. You know, all you read about in the New York Times by especially one columnist is all the killings that are happening. But that's not all of Africa. You know, there's one quarter or 2 quarters of Africa, but that kind of reporting and writing does huge amount of damage to Africa because every investor thinks that, gee, you know, this is all that's going on in Africa. So the reporters really have been very irresponsible too.
I just want to defend the New York Times. Howard is not there, that's why the reporting went down.
Do we have a mic out?
My name is Jeffrey Kazembe Batts. I'm an educator at LaGuardia Community College with pro-African purpose. My question is dealing with African development and financial resources. It's my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, at the beginning of the year, one of the most developed countries and with the highest standard of living on the African continent was Libya. led by Muammar Gaddafi, the first president of the African Union, and that he used some of his oil wealth to spread around the continent as an alternative source of finances instead of going to the World Bank or the IMF, et cetera, et cetera. So with Gaddafi's government out of power and no longer functioning, is there any indigenous African nation or source that can replace what has been lost?
You want to take that?
Look, if part of the question you ask me is which is some of the sort of frontier markets within the continent, or markets where there's significant development and prospects in terms of GDP growth, there are a number of those markets. And maybe again the impression might be played again because we're talking about Africa and therefore talking about more regional strategic approaches to dealing with the BRICS. There might have been inflation created, and there isn't a lot of that happening on the continent. Now earlier I said, for example, if you look at the continent, 7 out of 10 countries on the continent are projected. It's projected that they will grow at a rate of about 7% between 2011 and 2015. 7 countries, Mozambique, Ghana is one of those countries, but Nigeria, for example, is also considered to be one of those countries that is going to grow at a very rapid pace. Obviously, there are challenges in terms of the infrastructure there, but there are quite a number of countries on the continent where there is a lot of development happening. If you look to the question that was raised earlier around agriculture, 40% of the continent's GDP is from agriculture. And there have been lots of experiments that have shown positive results on the continent. Rwanda is one of those that have been cited, where agriculture and the use of technology, especially cellular or mobile phone technology, has been used effectively to create access to markets for farmers in Rwanda. The same as in Malawi, you found similar things. But to your question, yes, there are countries on the continent which you find that the projections for rapid GDP growth, yes, there are some challenges in terms of infrastructure, but I think there are a lot of positives emerging on the continent in terms of development.
Thank you.
My name is Carl Munna, publisher, RepublicReporters, here in New York City. I'm a Columbia University grad, 2004 class. My question to Howard French, the panel chair, and Harry Boardman, and anyone, the panelists who wants to actually contribute to this question is very much welcome. My question is on corruption and transparency within the continent. I don't think that the continent of Africa is poor. It's a very rich continent with resources, huge resources. My question to you is, why is it that Western nations, let me be specific, US, Britain, French mainly, seems to accept dubious funds from leaders from these continents? For instance, maybe Nigeria, for instance. Some of their resources, some of their national treasures were being looted, and these monies were kept in Swiss bank, billions of dollars, buying properties in the US, UK, France, and also the issue of IMF loan giving, even when they don't need it, they were encouraged to take it. And then they have to pay double, so to speak, in that process, the interest and so on and so forth. Is there a reason why, if I may ask, why the Western governments, even if they knew that these monies are actually corrupt funds, but they accept them within their banking system? Thank you.
And you addressed the question to me. I'm maybe not the best person to answer, but I'm going to give a very quick sort of first blush effort. I would say that, first, just like you can't say Africa meaningfully and speak of all the continent at once, I think that there are nuances between the Western countries that you've described or named. I don't think that any of them maintains a satisfactory standard in terms of making sure that the provenance of bank deposits and investment funds from other countries are inspected or looked at with any great degree of care. I think that there's a great deal of carelessness in that regard, generally. Meaning, I have a shingle over my door that says bank, and we take money. And you want to bring money here, I'll take it. That means carelessness. I think that there's much too much of that. I'm not a policy person, but Harry can speak to some of the nuances and the political implications of this. But I want to come back to something that Arvind said. I think that the problem, I agree with you, Africa is not poor. I think the problem is, however, the principal problem is, however, getting the citizens of African countries to demand that their leaders do not expatriate money from their countries, and getting the citizens of African countries to take ownership of their own affairs in a more vigorous way, to demand better from their leaders. It doesn't excuse any of what you're saying.
Yeah, basically, I mean, I'm here.
We don't have time for that, I'm sorry. It doesn't excuse anything that you're complaining about. I share your grief. But my answer to you is that there needs to be action from the other side of the coin to make any change.
The only thing I'll add, and you're quite right, and again, it's not unique to the United States and Europe or unique to Africa, but I'll just give you a case in point. You may know this, that the State Department asked many banks servicing African embassies in the United States to not service those embassies because there was, I'm not saying whether there was illegality or there wasn't, but they took action. Okay? It made many embassies, African embassies, very upset.
Which year was that?
About 9 months ago, 12 months ago. Okay. Well, no. Let's be fair and let's be dispassionate and let's look at the facts. Okay. And the issue that I want to embrace with Howard and Arvind and others is that African leaders, there's a disjuncture between the leadership and civil society, and first and foremost, the most important thing is reform at home, behind the border reforms in governance and economic reform and so forth. And I have a very positive outlook for Africa, but there is a potential that has to be exploited.
We have time for 2 more questions. There's a gentleman there, and a lady here. We'll go to the lady first.
Okay, I'll make this very brief. My name is Ketiwe Kamal. I'm a recent SIPA graduate. My question was actually directed at Mr. Kajumlis. There was a point made about linkages between economic growth and the domestic economy, and I just wanted you to go further into that, what you meant in terms of that those linkages are being established through policy work, but what type of linkages?
The linkages between what?
Economic growth and the domestic economy. I think you also put it as economic policy and poverty reduction.
No, I think it was in the context of mobilizing foreign direct investment, where I was saying that if you look at the investment promotion policy of the super African governments, they have really focused on mobilizing foreign direct investment, but there has not been enough linkages between the domestic economy and foreign direct investment. So what we need to do is to mobilize, to ensure that there are strong linkages between domestic and foreign by providing specific incentives. For example, to encourage foreign companies to source inputs domestically. I think that's what I was talking about. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
One final question, please. There's a gentleman here.
Hello. My name is Musa Coleman. I'm a financial economist. I practice at Wall Street. I have a question, and I just wanted to make it brief since we don't have time. Recently, there's this is specifically, because I think this topic is about BRICS, what actually BRICS has to offer to Africa. So I just wanted to concentrate on that. Recently, there's, I think they did, 2, 3, 4 days ago, there's a state visit by a Brazilian president in South Africa, and there's a proposal that they have to create this African club. And I just wanted to direct this question to Mr. Bowman or Mr. Matola. If this is created, what kind of African club are we looking at? if you really have any information, because that was presented I think 2 or 3 days ago. So I just wanted to know if you have a current information with regards to that. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm not sure when you say an African club. What I do know is the cooperation between India, Brazil, and South Africa, IPSA.
That was it's a proposal that President Zuma and President Zuma and the President of Brazil proposing that because of the the relationship between Brazil and Africa in terms of traditional relations with black people, he just had problems with that, and that's what he's trying to allude to. They have to have some sort of a black economic club, and this black economic club will actually foster investments and trade. I don't know whether you have any information with regards to that.
I don't know much about this either. I know that the Brazilian president was also in Mozambique on this same trip, and if my intuition is correct, there has been a long tradition that was perhaps started by the French of developed countries trying to create forum with African countries, fora with African countries, where they bring together a bunch of African countries with the foreign leadership of their country, as opposed to multilateral, meaning many African and many foreign countries. A French African, or an American African, or a Chinese African, or a fill-in-the-blank African forum. And as perhaps this is the latest wrinkle in that sort of trend. I don't think I have any great information about that. Probably can take another question or two. There's a gentleman in the leather coat here. Who else would like to ask a question, just so I have a sense, please?
My name is Ndiaye. I'm from Senegal. My name is Ndiaye from Senegal, from Indian of the United Nations. I addressed the question about the issue of currency in Africa.
Currency?
Yes. Africa is a huge country. It's a continent. Several continents. And we have several types of currency, several types of money. And now about unifying currency in order to improve growth, what should be better, what approach should be better to give from your perspective?
So you're asking if a unified currency would be better?
What approach should be better from your perspective to unify currency in Africa?
I'll just say that's hardly the first thing, or one of the first 10 things I would worry about. There's a lot else to worry about in terms of the policies which you wants to get in order. And unification of the currency within the same region is not necessarily a silver bullet. I mean, we all know what is going on in Europe currently. Did Greece not? Did whatever, whoever you want to hold responsible for the final decision, but was this a good idea for Greece to be in this kind of union? Probably. Now everybody would say unequivocally that this was a big mistake. It's simply they can't be undone. I think for a lot of the developing countries starting off, currency issue is one of the very later issues. Much more important is to manage your currency so that you don't create very high rates of inflation, which certainly then impact investment, etc. adversely. In general, I think you need macroeconomic stability. This is what, in fact, countries like Greece and Portugal thought they would buy by having the euro, but in the end, it hasn't delivered.
We've got one more question. Mr. Broadman may leave us in the midst of this question. He's got a flight. There's a gentleman in a light blue shirt there with his hand up.
Thank you. My question is actually for Mr. Broadman, so if you could hold on, that'd be great. Outside of natural resources...
He said if it's for him, he's leaving.
Should I stop now? Outside of natural resources, telecommunications and financial services have driven a lot of the growth in Africa over the last 10 years. Are there any particular sectors that you think will drive growth over the next 10 years, again, outside of the natural resources sector?
Yeah, well, I don't know if you're including agriculture in the natural resources sector. I suspect you're not.
No.
But if you look at the services sector, I mean, the gentleman from Senegal, what's going on, frankly, is back office services that used to be in the U.S. that migrated to India are now migrating, Anglophone countries, and similarly with France. So this is why my point about the services sector is not to be poo-pooed. There are other sectors that, whether it's water, infrastructure. There are lots of sectors where there are tremendous first mover advantages in Africa because we don't have the legacy assets that other regions have. Again, I'm very positive about Africa. I think the risks in general are highly overstated. The opportunities are highly understated. So, but first and foremost, we want this to be an African show, and that's where I draw the line.
Lark, shall we stop there? Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Thank you very much to my fellow.
Ladies and gentlemen, before leaving, I just wanted to let you know we will be having our closing remarks in this room right after this. So just stick around.
Hey, what's up, man? How's everything? I met you before, right? You had that event. So I got a shoe.
All
I'm just African, that's why. No, I work for Iron here. No. Actually, I just You're loyal. Don't get scared. What am I giving When you come to Ghana, you know what? I'm trying to build a network of African French markets. I have to be trading in Ghana right now. I don't know. But yeah, so I have a yeah, she's from Ghana. Very smart young lady. She wanted to approach me about the project. She was concerned about, young African